Hello, Kyle Dobbs here. We're going to talk a little bit about client communication strategies for today's pre-recorded materials. I'm going to dip a little bit into psychology and the psychology of communication and looking at different behavioral archetypes and how they may respond to different environments and different communication strategies and how you might be able to leverage those things towards a better experience for the people that you work with. So here we go. The big thing that we look at here is, looking at psychology and looking at communication strategies, looking at personality testing or behavior archetyping. What this is all built on is the understanding that most people tend to bias different environmental and communication or interaction based cues. And if you can figure out how people bias these cues within their daily lives, you can get a lot more insight into how to communicate the training process to them and how to make them feel more comfortable with it, especially when you're in a Gen Pop environment. This also works well with understanding how to motivate people and how to give them feedback for the things that they accomplish or the things that they're doing within a training session. So this is stuff that is incredibly important, in my opinion, and in my experience, but often overlooked within the industry. Right? We typically, as coaches, bias into the understanding or the thought process that everybody really understands how their body works and is super invested into sets and reps and anatomy and physiology and biomechanics and bioenergetics, all these things that we think is super cool and important. We assume that our clients also think is super cool and important. And that's not always the case. In fact, it's rarely the case. We typically have clients who are coming into a training environment because they feel like they have to be in a training environment, right? And they feel obligated to the experience. And sometimes they're coming in with a pretty high threat response from an autonomics perspective or a high level of hypervigilance, right? So thinking about the sympathetic nervous system, thinking about people who are coming in with higher resting heart rates, higher blood pressure, higher levels of adrenaline and epinephrine, higher levels of cortisol and glucocorticoids, potentially even dopamine, and lower levels of, kind of the things that would contribute to parasympathetic tone when we look at like serotonin and some of these other neurotransmitters. And these are things that are going to impact potentially negatively what their experience is with their coach. And if we can find ways to familiarize the training environment and communicate with them on a level that they're comfortable with, we can sometimes dampen down some of these initial autonomic responses and some of this stress to create a much better experience for them when they're working with us. And if somebody's having a better experience working with their coach, they're more than likely also going to have more intention and focus during their session, right? People are typically better at things they enjoy doing or they feel comfortable doing. So again, this can also lead to greater outputs, greater adherence, and a greater overall just occurrence of true behavior change, outside of the gym as well. So the things that we look at here is there's a few big categories that are typically measured within these personality tests and within these behavior archetypes. And those are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And these qualities influence how we perceive the people, the environments, and the information around us. And they can, and how we also can communicate those things or with those things, on our daily lives, right? So as I mentioned here, these can also be shaped by and shape our biases and the emotional connotation that we associate with specific people, places, and things, right? So understanding how a person perceives these things can help you better communicate and work with them as a coach. And the things that I typically have people just, again, think about during a session without overcomplicating some of this stuff is, can you identify their strategy and match them for better conversation and follow through? And can you use these strategies to decrease the overall threat response for a better experience, right? That's what we're going to try to get out of this little presentation today. So what I typically use here is the DISC assessment. And I use the DISC assessment because I was working with a behavioral psychologist in New York, partnering with them for corporate consulting, and she used it, and we had really good results with it, really good feedback from the people we were working with. And I've just kind of continued to use it throughout this process. And now that I've also completed my master's in organizational psychology, it's something that I still feel pretty strongly about, especially within the context that it's applicable for coaches. I think, again, it's going to be a little scaled down, but I do think it's beneficial. And this is built off of the California Psychology Inventory, the CPI, which most of these behavior archetypes are. And the prior to that, the work of Carl Jung, again, a very famous psychologist in his own right throughout the realm. So the disc incorporates, the D, the I, the S, and the C archetypes, and they all have their own biases and their own traits. And typically what we look at is, the D personality stands for dominance, and it's recognized in individuals who are very direct, results oriented, firm, strong willed, and forceful. Right. So these individuals are also typically extroverted, results oriented, and confrontational in conflict. Right. So kind of keep those things in mind. The I personality type, right? And I'm going to have a big chart for this here in a few slides for you, but this is characterized as influence and recognized in individuals who are outgoing, enthusiastic, optimistic, high-spirited, and lively. These individuals are typically extroverted, experience-oriented, and situationally confrontational or passive in conflict. As we get into the other half of this, we start looking at an S personality type, which is characteristic of steadiness, right? And recognize in individuals who are even-tempered, accommodating, patient, humble, and tactful. These individuals are typically introverted, experience-oriented, and passive in conflict. And then we have the C personality type, which is characterized as conscientiousness, and recognized in individuals who are analytical, reserved, precise, private, and systematic. These individuals are typically introverted, results-oriented, and situationally confrontational or passive in conflict. So as we kind of read through these and you're watching these videos, kind of be thinking about what kind of aligns with how you view yourself and how you perceive your own biases. Right? From an environmental perspective, from a communication perspective, and how you deal with confrontation, how you set goals, and how you orientate yourself to those goals is also going to be something that's going to be important as well. So are you a D? Are you an I? Are you an S? Are you a C? Are you a combination of a few different ones, right? Because we also have hybrids within these archetypes. And as we look at this sheet, I'll move my window around here so everybody can see. But as we look at this sheet, we start looking at hybrids between, the D and the I and the S and the C, and the C and the D, right? So all of these can have hybrids with the other archetypes that are bordering them. That being said, there are no diagonal hybrids, right? So there would never be a DS or a CI, for instance. But you could be a DI, an IS, an SC, or a CD. And the things that typically, again, these archetypes have in common are kind of listed here within this white circle as we start looking at the borders of these, right? So for instance, an IS would be particularly accepting, people-focused, empathizing, receptive, and agreeable, right? So as you're kind of looking through these, you can look at all the archetypes. You can see priorities. You can see motivators, fears, characteristics that you may notice, and then limitations, right? So the thing that I always try to also have people keep in mind is none of these archetypes are going to be more successful in any given environment than any of the others, right? So all of us have the ability to adapt to the environments that we're in, right? You can be an extremely introverted person, but work very successfully in an extremely extroverted environment. And that's okay. That's kind of how my career has been shaped. So I'm a CS, right? So this is where I kind of live, but I've worked in the fitness industry for my entire career. And I've worked in leadership and management. I've worked in education. I've presented in front of very large groups. So I've done things that are very extroverted as well. I've interacted with a lot of people for a lot of hours a day and was successful in that realm. However, because it was an adapted style, it did come with a higher systemic cost than if I was doing something that maybe matched my biases and my traits a little closer, right? So I had to learn how to regulate myself outside of work so I could recover from the higher stress that was being incorporated into my daily activities. And that's just something, again, stress isn't bad. Stress leads to adaptation, right? So that's a whole nother conversation, and one that we'll have when we start talking about autonomics in deeper depth. But that's something that I had to learn for fairly early in my career as I was coaching a lot of clients. I'd come home completely exhausted. I was living in New York City, in Manhattan, and it was just emotionally and cognitively exhausting for me, even though it wasn't necessarily physically exhausting. And when I was younger, I didn't understand that, but I was just drained all the time. And now having a better understanding of how I was just completely out of my element, it makes a lot more sense to kind of the systemic cost that was happening as I was trying to adapt into a new role within a new environment that didn't necessarily match my preferred skill set and preferences. Right. So you might find yourself in that position too. And these are things that we're going to talk in more depth about over the course of the next 10 weeks. So kind of, again, look at these, pause it. If you want to look at it a little closer, you can definitely pause the video, try to figure out kind of where you might lie on this. We will have a link to take this assessment. If you want to find out for sure where you lie on it, you'll find that in the Kajabi material on the website within the curriculum. So we'll link all that good stuff for you as well. And to close this up, again, just reiterating some of the things I already said, you can be hybrids of multiple archetypes, and you can have adapted styles based on your environments, right? So to review, adapted styles tend to lead to autonomic hyperactivity or a sympathetic nervous state due to personality and task environment mismatch. Not a bad thing, not a good thing, just something that is, and something that we need to account for. Adapted styles have nothing to do with one's ability to be a high performer, but rather their ability to self-regulate and cope with the stressors associated with that task or environment, right? Super important. An example would be an introverted individual in a position that requires a lot of public speaking and motivating, i.e. myself, right? And in the majority of my career, I'm getting a little sweaty just talking on camera right now, right? So pits are sweating a little bit, heart rate's elevated a little bit. Some of you might not have any problems with that. Some of you might be terrified by the sheer thought of doing something like this, right? So again, understanding what archetypes your clients may be can help you better communicate with them and program for them, right? Are they introverted or extroverted, right? How does that dictate where you place them in a session? How does that dictate how you carry through with their consultation? Even little things, right? If you know somebody's coming in for an assessment and you know ahead of time that they're introverted, you can have that assessment maybe in a more private environment, in a closed off room where that person doesn't feel anxious or self-conscious in front of a lot of people. If they're extroverted, you don't want them closed off because that might make them more anxious, right? So again, these little things can definitely influence the actual experience and sometimes even the outputs your clients are able to create, throughout that initial, one-on-one with you. Are they goal oriented or are they experiential? How do you relate feedback to them, right? Are you giving them empirical data because they're super goal oriented and they want to measure everything? Or are you asking them more about how they feel during a session or on an everyday basis because maybe they're more experiential? Maybe they're sticking around and their adherence is higher because they really enjoy the training session and they don't care that much about the numbers. Typically as coaches, we're a little more biased towards numbers, and it's hard for us to understand that not everybody is, but not everybody is. And that's something you definitely need to realize as well. How do they approach conflict? Because training is conflict, right? Do they approach it in a functional problem solving type frame or a dysfunctional emotional loss type of frame, right? How do you give them feedback? How do you express feedback to this person? These are super important. Even positive feedback can sometimes be very uncomfortable for somebody who's extremely introverted, right? Have you ever met somebody who has a hard time taking a compliment? You know, Matt makes fun of me all the time, but that's me. I have a very hard time taking compliments. I get super embarrassed by them, and it makes me uncomfortable, right? Especially publicly. So these are things that you also need to understand, right, when you're working with people. So just to wrap it up, again, we don't want to get too deep into the weeds. We don't want to become, you know, kind of half-assed psychologists on a training floor. But if you can identify where people might live, you know, on this realm, you can probably provide a better experience for them. And within the case study, we have some cheat sheets where you can utilize some strategies to work with different people. Typically, we will have the option of either giving clients the disc if they really want to do it, or we just build some questions into the actual intake form where we talk about extroversion. You know, are they introverted or extroverted? We find out really early on what their goals are, and how they express their goals to us lets us know oftentimes if they're very, again, numerically based or empirically based, or if they're more conscious and experientially based. And then looking at how they express feedback gives us some clues too, right? So if we have somebody right off the bat who we know is pretty extroverted and we know is more experiential, well, we know that person's probably somewhere on that I realm, right? And that gives us some clues on how maybe we can approach them and set up a better experience for them. And all that stuff can be worked into the actual intake form, which is great. And that gives us a lot of clues without having to, again, be psychology nerds with people. Just provide a better experience. So hopefully this is beneficial to you. This is stuff that we're definitely going to talk more about through the normal curriculum. But we just wanted to give you a little background information on it prior to the actual calls. All right. So thank you. And can't wait to get started with you guys in a couple weeks.